Some voting practices allowed during the pandemic would be illegal today under new state voting laws passed by some Republicans. So far, GOP lawmakers have enacted voting restrictions in 11 states in the wake of the 2020 election. But as the Washington Post points out, in several states, quote, the number of votes cast by methods since eliminated or banned by legislators was comparable to the final margin between Biden and Trump. Democrats are hoping their federal election reform bill will counter the new voting restrictions. But that legislation has yet to make it to the Senate floor. Dave Weigel wrote that piece. He's a national reporter for The Washington Post and author of the Trailer newsletter. Hi there, Dave. So you write that in the absence of voter fraud, Republicans are focusing on legally cast ballots. What do they argue makes some ballots illegal?
Well, that phrase legal ballots or legally cast ballots is one you started to see Republicans led by Donald Trump using as the election got closer. And it doesn't mean votes that are fake. It might sound that way. It means that if somebody casts a legal voter, a registered voter cast a vote, for example, one of the things I read about at an event in Madison, Wisconsin, where people could go to a park and deliver their votes in person to county officials. Those voters, they say, that should have cast them through a more traditional method that was not was used before this year. Therefore, those votes should have been illegal. And that's sort of the premise of a lot of this legislation. So you're seeing, and you saw this in Ari Burns reporting at Mother Jones, there are a lot of model legislation that came together from conservative think tanks like Heritage, from Republicans, reverse engineering what happened in 2020 and saying, what are some things that were implemented that we think cost us votes? One of them I just mentioned, sort of these in-person events. There are mobile voting centers, so buses that people could go in that were staffed polls, staffed monitored polls. They got rid of those in Georgia. They got rid of some of the options for voters who show up to the wrong precinct. Basically, in states Republicans controlled the process, they didn't go after fraud per se, and there was a little, but not enough to swing these races. What they went after were rules that they say would not have been approved by the Republican legislature, therefore should have not been used in the first place. That people shouldn't have been voting through this method, so they can't do it again.
So that, again, I think answers my next question, because it is not, it's not being debated whether or not these pandemic-related changes made it easier for people to vote. We know that they did. How is it specifically that Republican lawmakers are justifying reversing those changes? It sounds like they're hanging it on the fact that these are not changes implemented by these legislatures.
Yes, and not to be cynical, but you didn't hear a lot of discussion about this provision of the Constitution that the Electoral College, the rules for electors are set by state legislatures. In courts, sometimes, who creates a Secretary of State's office? Who creates counties? It's often the state legislatures who do that. So this idea that that any changes to the voting that are not signed off by legislators, people who cannot act as quickly as an election official, retroactively they said those shouldn't have happened. That was the basis of the Pennsylvania lawsuit, for example. That most Republicans in the House supported, the idea that the court should look and see if you can get rid of ballots that were cast by rules that the state legislature itself did not affirm. And the Pennsylvania case is more complicated than that. But that's kind of the trend. The Republican argument became sort of a state legislative supremacy, and it became that at a point in history where Republicans run the state legislatures of most states. For example, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are places with Democratic governors. The argument, fairly conveniently, is that the Democratic governors and the Democratic election officials shouldn't have been changing the laws. Only the legislators who are not of a mind to do that should change the laws. And that is the premise that's going through all this legislation. I singled out in that article the states where this was more than the margin between Biden and Trump, because that was what a lot of these lawsuits after the election, trying to throw out ballots cast these measures, that's what they were about. In Wisconsin, the effort was to toss out ballots from Dane and Milwaukee County, the two biggest Democratic counties, if they were cast by a method that the legislature didn't approve. There were more than enough votes, had that been done, to throw the margin into disarray. All you have to do here is listen to former President Trump. He, as a consumer, I think, of the news on this, somebody who is talking to lawyers, who watches the conservative media that covers these election challenges, he has advanced this idea that if legislatures didn't approve it, they should have gone out and got rid of, negated enough ballots in states to make him president again. That is the premise of all this Republican legislation.
So, Dave, you mentioned those 2 counties in Wisconsin. Let's zoom out a bit. If these new rules were in place during the 2020 election, which states would most likely have had a different winner?
Well, Georgia absolutely would have. In Pennsylvania, that was more than 2 million ballots that Republicans were trying to toss out. If they had restricted absentee ballots the way that they say they did, even though it was about an 80,000 vote Biden margin, that probably would have been affected by it. Michigan was probably too big of a margin, but Arizona's one where the legislature has passed, the governor has signed rules that, for example, are going to start removing people from the rolls they hadn't voted in the last couple elections. Now, this was a very high turnout election in 2020. There were lots of voters who maybe had been on the rolls and not really taken advantage of the process. Maybe they went to the DMV, they got the driver's license, they got registered to vote, they didn't use it for a couple of years. There are people who would have been kicked off the rolls or would have gotten absentee ballots that they ended up using for those elections.
So former President Trump has been commenting on the audit of 2020 ballots in Maricopa County, Arizona. What's the latest, Dave, on that audit?
It's a bit of a mess. It started as a mess, and I think it's gotten messier. The venue, which is the fairgrounds in Phoenix that Republicans were using for the audit, they only had it reserved until this past Friday. They moved the ballots for a week so that another event that had the space reserved could finish. They're moving back, they say, when that's done, and have the venue again until the end of June. They might not be done by the end of June. They've tried to get faster, but they've got more than 2 million ballots to count, or to audit, I should say, in Maricopa County. They say they only got past about 500,000 in a multi-week, more than 3-week process. So at that pace, if they don't speed up, they won't be done by the end of June.
Dave Weigel for us. Dave, always great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the setup, but thank you.